My mother looked me dead in the eyes across the dinner table and said, "We're cutting your tuition effective immediately." I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I picked up my fork, finished the last bite of mashed potatoes on my plate, set the fork down gently, and said one word, "Okay." My sister's head snapped toward me so fast I heard her neck crack. "That's it, just okay?" I looked at her. That's it. What none of them knew, not my mother, not my father, not my sister with her pearl earrings and her perfect highlighted hair, was that by the time I said that word, I had already made my decision. I had already begun to disappear. I need to back up. I grew up in a house in Naperville, Illinois, the kind of suburb where every lawn is exactly the same shade of green and every family has exactly the same problems they never talk about. My parents weren't rich, but they weren't struggling either. My father spent 30 years as a regional sales director for a pharmaceutical distribution company. My mother managed the household and, as she liked to say, the family's reputation, which mostly meant she cared deeply about how things looked from the outside. There were two of us, me and my sister Camille. Camille was 2 years older, 4 inches taller, and had our mother's cheekbones and our father's confidence. She had always been the one people noticed first when we walked into a room. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I've had enough years and enough therapy to know the difference between fact and wound. But it is the truth. Camille lit up rooms. I tended to observe them. Growing up, I told myself the difference in how my parents treated us was just personality. Camille was louder, more social, easier to celebrate. I was quieter, more internal, the kid who read too many books and asked too many questions that made adults uncomfortable. I told myself that was why my parents forgot to come to my junior year academic award ceremony, but rented a party bus for Camille's college acceptance. I told myself that was why they paid for Camille's semester abroad in Florence, but told me international programs were a luxury we can't justify right now. I was 20 years old before I stopped telling myself those stories. The real shift happened when Camille got engaged. His name was Trevor, and he came from what my mother called good stock, which meant his family had a lake house in Michigan, and his grandfather had been a federal judge. Trevor was handsome in a catalog model kind of way, harmless enough, not particularly interesting. But he adored Camille, which meant my mother adored Trevor, which meant Trevor's family became the new sun our entire household orbited around. Suddenly, everything was about the wedding, the venue, the dress, the rehearsal dinner, the engagement photos, the shower. My mother started referring to Trevor's mother by her first name, which she had never done with any of my friends' parents in 22 years. She started using phrases like "our families" when she talked about the future. I was a junior at the University of Illinois at Chicago, finishing a degree in accounting. I had a 3.8 GPA. I had 2 part-time jobs. I paid for my own books, my own groceries, my own public transit pass. My parents covered tuition and the basics of my off-campus apartment, not generously but consistently, and I was grateful for it. I had 1 more year to go. I want you to understand what 1 year meant. 1 year stood between me and a degree that would change the trajectory of my entire life. 1 year. The dinner where everything changed happened on a Thursday in October. Camille and Trevor had driven up from their apartment in Wicker Park to have dinner at my parents' house, the way they did most weekends now. My mother had made a pot roast. The table was set with the good china, which only came out for Camille's visits anymore. Somewhere between the salad and the main course, my father cleared his throat and said they needed to talk about some family financial adjustments. I thought it was going to be about the wedding costs. I was prepared to nod and smile and be supportive. Instead, my mother folded her hands on the table and explained that Trevor's family had invited my parents to co-invest in a real estate development project in the western suburbs. A commercial property renovation. The kind of opportunity, she said, that didn't come along twice. The kind of opportunity that would secure the family's future. My father said they had decided to liquidate some assets to make it work. My mother said my tuition was one of those assets. I remember the sound of the refrigerator humming in the next room. I remember the way Trevor was suddenly very interested in the pattern on his dinner plate. I remember Camille not looking at me at all. Mother explained it very practically, the way she explained everything. I had enough credits to apply for federal aid. There were payment plans. Community college was also an option for finishing out certain requirements. She said it with the tone of someone describing a slightly inconvenient but ultimately manageable detour. I said, "Okay." Camille looked at me like I had just spoken in tongues. I excused myself from the table, said I wasn't feeling well, drove 45 minutes back to my apartment in Chicago, and sat on the floor of my bathroom for a long time. Then I got up, made a cup of coffee, opened my laptop, and started making a list. Here is what I knew that my family did not know I knew. 6 months earlier, I had been home for the weekend and had accidentally walked in on a phone call my father was having in his office. He hadn't heard me come in. I backed out immediately, but I had heard enough. He was talking to someone about moving money, about the company's quarterly audit, about a name I didn't recognize at the time, a consulting firm I'd never heard of. He sounded nervous in a way I had never heard my father sound before. I didn't think much of it at the time. I filed it away the way you file away things that don't quite make sense yet. After the dinner, I started thinking about it again. I am an accounting student. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I was not some amateur poking around in things I didn't understand. I understood exactly what I was looking at when I started pulling threads. I started with public records. Illinois business filings are public. I looked up the consulting firm name I had heard on that phone call, and what I found was interesting. The firm had been incorporated 18 months ago, listed my father as a registered agent, and had one listed client, my father's employer. That was the first thread. Over the next 3 weeks, I spent every hour I wasn't in class or at work sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad and my laptop. I pulled court records, I pulled Secretary of State filings, I cross-referenced, I made timelines. I called the Illinois Secretary of State's public inquiry line twice, identifying myself as a student doing research, and both times the staff were more helpful than I expected. What emerged was not a clean picture, but it was a real one. My father had been running a billing scheme through his employer for at least 4 years. The consulting firm was a pass-through. Fake services billed to the company, payments routed out, books balanced in a way designed to survive a casual audit but not a forensic one. The amounts were not small. Over 4 years, I estimated somewhere between $380,000 and $420,000. Based on what I could piece together from the fragments of public documentation and what I remembered from that overheard phone call. The investment opportunity with Trevor's family was not an investment. It was a way to move money into a legitimate-looking asset before the next serious audit cycle hit. Camille either didn't know or didn't want to know. I genuinely did not know which was worse. I sat with all of this for 2 days. I ate cereal for most of those 2 days because I kept forgetting to cook real food. I called my best friend and cried in a way I hadn't cried since middle school. Then I dried my face, went back to my legal pad, and decided what I was going to do about it. I want to be honest about something. I thought about doing nothing. There is a version of this story where I quietly transfer to a cheaper school, take out loans, finish my degree on my own terms, and never speak to my family about what I found. I thought about that version seriously. It was cleaner, it was safer, it required me to simply remove myself and move on. But there was a problem with that version. My father's company employed over 200 people in the Chicago area. Many of them were in logistics and distribution roles, working-class jobs, union jobs, the kind of employment that mattered to families in a real way. The billing scheme he had been running was directly reducing the budget available for those departments. I had found 2 rounds of layoffs in the company's press releases over the period his scheme had been running. 12 people cut in one round, 8 in another. I could not unknow that. I also thought about going to my father directly. I drafted that conversation in my head 100 times. But I had heard enough of that phone call 6 months ago to know that my father was not a man who would respond to being confronted by the daughter he'd just defunded with contrition. He would respond by getting ahead of it. He would call it a misunderstanding. He would make me look unstable. He would have time to move things around, call lawyers, prepare a story. I was not going to give him that time. I contacted an attorney through the University of Illinois Chicago's legal aid referral program. She was a third-year associate at a mid-size firm who did pro bono work with students, and she was, I will say, one of the sharpest people I have ever met in my life. I laid out everything I had on that kitchen table, the legal pad, the printed filings, the timelines, the phone records I had managed to reconstruct from memory, and I watched her read through it without saying a word. When she finished, she looked up at me and said, "How long did it take you to put this together?" I said 3 weeks. She said, "You're in accounting?" I said yes. She said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do." What we did took another 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, I went home for Thanksgiving. I sat at the table with my parents and Camille and Trevor and ate turkey and talked about the weather and the bears and whether the kitchen needed to be repainted. I helped my mother with the dishes. I hugged my father goodnight. I was the most pleasant dinner guest I had ever been in my life. My mother commented on it, actually. She said I seemed more settled lately. more mature. She said the financial adjustment had clearly helped me find some independence. It really has, I said. What was actually happening during those 6 weeks, my attorney had made a formal referral to the FBI's Chicago field office, specifically their financial crimes unit. This is not a television procedural, this was paperwork and timelines and multiple preliminary meetings and a lot of waiting. But the FBI does not ignore $400,000 in documented fraud, and they especially do not ignore it when a neat, well-organized packet of preliminary documentation lands on the right desk. What I did not know during those 6 weeks was that my father's company had already flagged an internal anomaly in their third-quarter audit. The FBI's inquiry arrived at approximately the same time their own forensic accountant did. I learned this later. At the time, I was just waiting. 2 days before Christmas, my attorney called me. She said, "It's moving." I was at my apartment in Chicago when it happened. I know this because I was on the phone with my grandmother in Indiana, wishing her an early Merry Christmas when my best friend sent me a text that just said, "Check the news." My father was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation that, according to a brief statement from his company, had been initiated in cooperation with federal authorities. His name wasn't public yet, but I knew. I sat down on my couch and I stayed there for a long time. My phone rang 20 minutes later. It was my mother. She said there had been a misunderstanding at my father's company. She said it was all a confusion about accounting procedures, the kind of thing that happened all the time in corporate environments, and their lawyer was already handling it. She asked if I had seen anything online, and I said I had seen a little. She said not to worry, and that I shouldn't say anything to anyone, and that family stuck together in hard times. Of course, I said, I know that. She asked if I was coming home for Christmas. I said I was going to my friend's family's house this year. There was a pause. "Since when?" my mother said. "Since now," I said. "Merry Christmas, Mom." I hung up and I sat in the quiet of my apartment and I thought about all the dinners at that table. All the good china that came out for Camille and not for me. All the years I had made myself smaller and more agreeable and more convenient, trying to earn something that was never going to be offered. I was done being convenient. The federal investigation moved faster than my attorney had expected, partly because the company's internal forensic audit had independently uncovered significantly more than I had been able to document on my own. The final number was not $400,000, it was closer to $610,000, spread over 5.5 years. My father's attorney entered negotiations in February. By April, there was a plea agreement. He did not go to trial. He pled guilty to wire fraud and was sentenced to 27 months in federal prison, 3 years supervised releases, and full restitution to his former employer. The real estate investment with Trevor's family evaporated. The money my parents had contributed could not be returned because it had already been commingled in a way that made recovery complicated. Trevor's family, to their credit or perhaps their self-interest, quietly withdrew from the arrangement and returned what they could. Camille called me in March before the plea was finalized. It was the first time we had spoken since the previous October. She did not open with hello. She said, "Did you have anything to do with this?" I had been waiting for that question for 5 months. I said, "I reported what I found to the appropriate authorities." "Yes." The silence on the line was so long I checked twice to make sure the call was still connected. Then Camille said, "He's our father." And I said, "He's also the man who paid for your Florence semester while running a fraud that got 20 people laid off. He's the man who cut my tuition so he could move dirty money into a real estate deal. I know he's our father." That didn't stop him from doing any of those things. Camille hung up. I set my phone face down on the counter and made myself a cup of tea. My hands were not shaking. That surprised me. I had expected my hands to shake. I want to tell you about the part that doesn't make the clean version of this story, because I think it's the most important part. My mother called me 6 times in the 2 weeks after the plea agreement was announced. I answered twice. In those conversations, she was alternately devastated and furious, and the fury, when it came, was directed entirely at me. She said I had destroyed the family. She said I had turned on my own blood. She said she didn't know who I had become. The second time she said that last one, I said, "I think I'm the person I always was. You just didn't look closely enough." She didn't have an answer for that. I told her I loved her because I did, in the complicated way you love people who have caused you real harm and are also just human beings who made choices. I told her I was not going to carry the guilt of his actions on her behalf. I told her I hoped she found her footing. Then I stopped answering the calls, not forever, but for a while. I needed to be able to breathe without someone else's wreckage in my lungs. I finished my degree. I want to say that plainly and without drama because it is the thing I am most proud of, and it almost didn't happen. After my father was placed on leave, I filed an emergency appeal with the university's financial aid office, documenting the change in my family's financial circumstances. With my previous academic record, I qualified for a need-based grant that covered most of my remaining tuition. I took out a small loan for the rest. I picked up a third part-time job for 1 semester. I was doing tax prep at an H&R Block 2 nights a week on top of everything else, and I graduated in May with a 3.7 GPA and honors in my department. My grandmother came to my graduation. My best friend came. My aunt on my mother's side, who had always been quietly kind to me in a way the rest of them weren't, came with flowers. My mother did not come. Camille did not come. I had expected that. I had prepared for it. And it still landed like a stone in the center of my chest when I walked across that stage and looked out at the seats and counted the faces I knew. 4 people. 4 people who chose to show up because they wanted to. But here is what I keep coming back to every time I turn this over. 4 people who chose to show up because they wanted to is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. My father was released after serving 19 months with good behavior. I know this because my aunt told me. I have not spoken to him since the October dinner, where my mother told me my education was a line item they were cutting. I am not sure what I would say. I have thought about it. I have written versions of it in a journal that I keep for exactly this kind of unresolvable thing. I am not ready, and I have made peace with not being ready, which is its own kind of progress. Camille and I have texted 3 times in the past year. Short, surface-level exchanges. Happy birthday. Hope you're well. The temperature of strangers who once shared a childhood bedroom. I now work for a regional CPA firm in downtown Chicago. I specialize in forensic accounting and fraud examination. My manager, when he reviewed my application, noted my academic concentration in that area and asked what drew me to it. I told him I had some personal experience with why it mattered. He laughed, assuming I meant an internship or a case study. I smiled and let him assume. I think about that October dinner more than I probably should. Not with the searing pain I felt in those first months. It's less sharp now, more like a scar that pulls when the weather changes. I think about the specific smallness of being sat down at the good china table and told that my future was a budget line. Told this in front of my sister who looked at the tablecloth and my brother-in-law who was already planning where to put the money. I think about the word I said. Okay. I have turned that word over in my mind many times since then. At the time, I said it because I was in shock. But I have come to think of it differently now. That okay was not surrender. It was me stepping back far enough to see the full shape of what I was dealing with. You cannot make good decisions from inside the blast radius. You have to get some distance first. By the time I drove back to Chicago that night, I already understood that the dinner table was not where this was going to be resolved. The kitchen was not the arena. I needed a different one. I found one. The woman who got laid off because a departmental budget was quietly drained. I don't know her name. I will never know her name. But I think about her sometimes, going home with a cardboard box, wondering what happened, what she did wrong, why she was let go when she had done everything right. I think about the fact that the thing that happened to her was not an accident or a market condition or bad luck. It was a choice someone made while sitting at a table with good china. That is the thing I needed people to understand. Not for sympathy. I have a job I love and an apartment that is mine, and 4 people who showed up for me when it counted. I don't need anyone's sympathy. I needed people to understand that the math of these things eventually balances. Not always through courts, not always through federal agencies, not always with a neat timeline and a documented plea agreement. But in one form or another, the ledger corrects. I am an accountant. I believe in that more completely than I believe in most things. The family they built their empire around dissolved it. The investment they sacrificed my education for never existed. The golden daughter moved to Cincinnati with Trevor last year, and from what my aunt tells me quietly, they are working through some hard things of their own. And I am here in my apartment on the north side of Chicago, with coffee going and case files open on my kitchen table, doing work that matters, in a life that is entirely and completely my own. I set the fork down that October night and said one word. It took me a long time to understand that the word was not defeat. It was the starting gun.